There are plenty of people still today that are working on projects that no one knows what they're working on. There are plenty of people that go to work every day and they can't tell their partners what they're doing. Moreover, there are plenty of things that governments are doing that civilians have no idea what they're doing. Well, I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, which is a secret Manhattan Project site. It's a lesser known Manhattan Project site. So Los Alamos is a secret Manhattan Project site. They're building the atomic bomb, Manhattan Project being the creation of the atomic bomb. And there were these outposts throughout the US. And so I grew up in one of those outposts. A friend told me about a high school and their football team, their American football team, um, is they're the home of the atomic bombers. So they, there's a gigantic mushroom cloud in the background, and that's sort of their pride. And even in the 60s, they would, cheerleaders could be heard on the sidelines yelling, "Nuke 'em." And I started to wonder about that still takes place today in America, and what that says about our atomic legacy, and what that says about the present state of America, and what that says about loyalty. And that led me to go back to the creation of the atomic bomb. I was reading things about from the male scientist perspective and how they conducted the science. But it wasn't until I accessed work by female scientists that I realized that there was this domestic side of the story. I came across a female scientist's memoir, and she was describing the science behind the project, and she was very pro-nuclear bomb. And so her book really is she's trying to make an argument for why it was a really great idea that the bombs were used. But in the background of that, on two separate occasions, she mentions that her mentor was Enrico Fermi, and that, she talks about Enrico and her relationship with Enrico, but she mentions that Enrico Fermi's wife, Laura, never really seemed to like her. And she comes back to it later, and I don't think that she never really addresses it. It's not a primary concern of the book, but that became a generative space for me, because I realized that was the voice that we hadn't heard. Who were these women? And so I contacted the Los Alamos Historical Society, still around in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and they had gathered a lot of oral histories from the perspective of these women. And so I started listening to these oral histories. They would be asked things like, what was life like for you at Los Alamos? And they would immediately move from the I to the we perspective. So what I realized was that it seemed like a very natural progression to move from what I thought was a singular point of view to a first-person plural point of view, because the women seemed to really see themselves as this large group. But it was more than that, because I think in any way that we see ourselves as part of a large group, there's both power in that, there's power in number, and there is anonymity in number, and there is a loss of identity in number. And so it became a way for me to explore those tensions between the group identities we have and the individual, which then pushes against the group. And I saw that as a theme reflected in the way that they were recounting their stories. So it was initially, I thought, going to be a nonfiction project. It's very much based on research. I don't really make much up, but the women aren't alive, most of them, so I couldn't ask follow-up questions. And they would make hints at things, but they would never move into a little more information than I wanted. So I was using the inspiration from what they had given. I find that people don't usually like to tell their secrets, and they don't usually like to confess things that they feel bad about, particularly to strangers at historical society that are interviewing them. So I had to go off of those moments and then move into fiction.